How many of you guys grew up in the 80s? 80s, 90s, Gen Xer kids? Yeah, a few of you guys. You might identify with this. You know, I was not like a really angry kid. There wasn't a lot that could get a rise out of me. But if you really want to get on my bad side, if I heard you talking smack about Star Wars, man, I mean, that could set me off. Just because I could not understand it, right? Like, if somebody watched the same films that I watched, and somehow they drew the conclusion that those were not good, I just could not, it would start with confusion, right? But then confusion would go to suspicion, because I'd be like, you got an angle or something. You're playing at something here, because there's no way that you could watch those movies and feel like they aren't good. And then eventually, if you kept pressing that button, then suspicion would give way to hostility, right? Like, I'm not going to go to blows over much, but if you're knocking Luke Skywalker, there was a chance when I was a kid. And you might be thinking, that you got issues, man, you got issues. But you do it too, okay? You do it too. This is a common thing. I'm going to prove it to you right now with one picture. How many of y'all know what this picture is? Yes. This is the dress that broke the internet a few years ago. This is the divided the world. What color is it? Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah, everybody's all over the map. There's some really weird stuff about this picture. This picture is so overexposed that you can't completely see the colors clearly, but everybody sees something that they feel very confident about. And then the person next to them might see it, and they're very confident as well, but they see completely different colors, right? And that's so triggering, right? It's like, what? How in the world could you be taking in the same information and coming to a different conclusion? The weird thing about this picture is this actually set off some scientific research, because there were sociological scientists. They were like, I don't know what caused this. We're going to dig into it. And the best they can come up with right now is that they figure that your brain is filling in the gap here. This is what your brain does for you. It does it all the time, which is really handy. If there's a discrepancy and there's a gap, it fills it with previous information. So when you're looking at a picture like this one, which is so overexposed, to be honest, your eyes can't see much of any color. And so your brain does something for you. It's like, I'm going to fill in the range of colors that you're missing. So it draws on your experience. If you spend a lot of time in outdoor light, then it fills in a certain range of colors that outdoor light provides, and it sends the picture in a certain direction, and you see it a certain color. And then if you spend a lot of your time indoor light, it's a whole different color range. It inserts that color range. All of a sudden, you go to this way. So that's why some people see this as white and gold. Some people see it as blue and black. If you're colorblind like me, it's a mess, all right? So we're not even going to go there, but it's crazy, right? That your brain actually fills in the gap for you. It interprets in ways that you're not even aware of. And this happens all the time. But the truth is, we don't actually see it happening, right? Like, we see the evidence, and then we see a conclusion, but we don't see all the stuff that happens in between. So, like, you are presented with information, new information, and that information goes in to your brain and makes its way out in the form of a conclusion. You're like, okay, if you can't see, it's on the bottom here in the left-hand corner. It's like that information went in, and this is the obvious and clear conclusion. There's actually a name for this. It's called the fundamental attribution error. It's a term that they say, like, hey, everyone sees their view as the obvious, inevitable, and correct conclusion, right? That's the only way you can see it. The evidence is clear, right? So, but what's really happening is something that looks like this. So when somebody else takes in the same information, they see the same movie, they take in the same experience, they see the same evidence that you saw, and it goes into their matrix of stuff, and sometimes it does come out in the right place, and you're like, that confirms that you think the way I think, and so that must be the right way to think, and then somebody else comes along, and how'd you see the same thing? We both agree. Like, we both saw it, and it was clear that it came out this way. But you saw the same thing and you came to a different conclusion. How is that possible? And so whenever that happens, that creates a divide, right? That creates a divide. And whenever there's a divide, then it starts an inevitable process. And it starts with confusion. And then confusion leads to suspicion. Because if you saw the same evidence that I did and you came to a different conclusion, there's only three possibilities. Only three possibilities at play here. You're either very naive, like you're kind of dumb, like honestly, that's what we're thinking. Secondly, you could be evil. Maybe you're just a terrible person. And you did this because you're evil. Or three, you're a part of a vast conspiracy to consolidate power and steal from me. That's the three places we usually go. When we see a conclusion that we don't understand, we're going to go to one of those three places. And guess what? That's what they're thinking about you too. I mean, they're looking at you and they're thinking, how could you possibly have seen this evidence and come to a different conclusion? And then this gap comes in. This divide kicks in. And then it sends us in very different directions and we're unable to speak to each other. We're unable to communicate. We're unable to influence. And the cost is huge. And this can be small things like a movie, right? Or, what kind of chips you like. Or, honestly, some of you guys are still using Android phones and I don't get it. I'm just going to speak on behalf of the rest of the world. You're jacking up our group text, and it's wrong, and it feels to me clear, and I know that you have a reason to see it the other way, but it's wrong, and so it's hard for me. But, there could be small things like that, but it can be huge things. It can be big things. It could be, how do we fairly split an inheritance? That word fair, it can go a lot of ways. It can be politics. We've seen that. I think we're familiar with that. It can be faith. What seems clear, obvious, and inevitable to me, to somebody else, it goes into their range of experiences and past relationships and narratives that they've believed since they were a child, and they come out with a completely different view, and it seems clear, obvious, and inevitable to them. And then we have a divide. And what happens is we feel threatened. We feel threatened by the divide. We feel threatened when we hear contrary evidence, and so our defenses come up, and we feel like we got hit, so we hit back. We hit back, and then we retaliate, and we try to dominate, or we try to humiliate, and then we end up in kind of a trench warfare situation where we're hurling messages at each other. We're like, I love you, here's a grenade, we're tossing stuff across the divide, and it's not making an impact, not the one that we want anyways. And so I know some of you might be thinking that, Reece, are you saying there's no such thing as truth, that there's just whatever people experience it, and it's like, no, I'm team truth, right? Like if there was a jersey for team truth, I'd have home and away and all the alternates, right? All the weird colors that come out to commemorate special occasions. I'd have all of them, okay? So I am team truth. I believe in objective truth, but I believe also that the way we contend for truth often creates more enemies than allies. And I don't think it has to be that way. There are more casualties of war than there needs to be, because that inevitable slide from confusion to suspicion to hostility, it often doesn't end there. You know where it goes next? Contempt. We get into contempt. Contempt isn't just, I disagree with you. It's, I can't stand you. I don't hate what you think. I hate you. And it's hard to uncross that bridge. And this matters, right? This matters because this is like for students in the room, for students or kids, you're like, this is why you can sit at the dining room table and look at your parents and be like, how can you be so ignorant? Right? Like you're thinking that, and you know what your parents are thinking? They're looking at you like, how could you possibly be so blind? Right? And some of you are thinking, how can conservatives be so heartless? And on the other side, they're thinking, how can liberals be so naive? And we just can't seem to understand or see each other. And this matters because the relationships that have blown up in your life over things that you just couldn't see eye to eye on, and now every time you sit down, you can't help but resurface the same argument over and over again, and you've never been able to move past it, and you've lost relationships. Family relationships, some of you. It matters because at work, this could cost somebody their job, the way these things blow up. This matters because if you're a Jesus follower, then reaching people across the divide is mission critical. It's what we do, right? We have a message that people inherently are skeptical of and tend to disagree with, and we're trying to have influence to get them to change their minds. So it matters. We have to be able to do better at this, right? This is mission critical. We have to get better at this, and if we're going to get better, We're going to need an example because there's not a lot of great examples out there. But imagine if we had an example of someone who lived in a culture that was super divided politically, religiously, economically, socially, and they just killed this. They just reached out across all those divides, and they showed us a way. You already know this, but we have such an example. Luckily, Jesus. We're going to jump into Luke chapter 19, and we're going to see one example of where he does this. So you knew it was going to be Jesus because you're in church, but this story is familiar, but I want you to see it a little differently. I want you to see it as a story of Jesus persuading the unpersuadable. Jesus reaching the lost cause, because that's really what's happening here. So verse 1 starts out this way. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. And this is important because I want you to think about your mindset when you're headed somewhere else, like you're on your way from one place to another. You're least likely to notice people in need. You're least likely to notice or be patient for some type of relational dynamic. You're least likely to see what's going on around you when you're going from one place to another. And that was Jesus' mindset here. He's really just passing through on his way somewhere else. So what happens? A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. And so this is really important because we don't necessarily get the first century context. I don't want you to think the way, like if you're at a party and you meet somebody and they're like, oh, I work for the IRS. And you're like, oh, haha, joke, something like that. That's not this. This is very different. Tax collectors in Israel in the first century were the most despised group of people in their communities. You could not imagine how divided they were from their group. What's happening here? In the first century world, you also have to know, this is like, we think our culture is polarized and divided. This was wildly more accelerated than that. Millennials, you guys think you invented cancel culture? Y'all are amateurs. This is Bush League cancel culture compared to these guys. All right, so what happened is, these were not, Israel was an occupied territory. They were under Roman authority, and they paid Roman taxes. And Rome might tax you 50% of your income, which was not unheard of at that time. And so then a tax collector would be recruited from your community. This is not a Roman, this was a Jew. And what this guy would do is he would take that 50% and he'd say, let's make it 70. And I'm going to take the 20. And behind him is a Roman's guard with a sword. And you don't have a lot of options. Can you imagine how despised this man was? He wasn't just a tax collector, he was the chief tax collector. He led the group, right? He was the most successful at extorting his people for personal wealth, right? Like, this is unbelievable. So this guy, you could not imagine how people viewed him. He was a lost cause. He was lost to his people. He was lost to God. And they had no regard or time for him. So what happens next? Zacchaeus, wanted to see who Jesus was. He sees there's a big crowd. People are gathering around. He's like, what's going on here? What's this? But because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. And this is our favorite part of the story. It's so funny. So he ran ahead and he climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. And if you grew up in church, this is like, you cue the song, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Y'all know this. Wee little man was he. Yep, see, you know it. Yeah, you could go the whole way, but we're not going to do it right now because I'm on the clock. But okay, so I don't want the familiarity to kind of hijack you here. This isn't just a story about a short guy who climbed a tree. This is bigger than that. You know what a normal person in Israel could have done if they were vertically challenged and wanted to see? They could just move up in the crowd. People would just let them through and they could get closer. That wasn't on the table for Zacchaeus. If he tries to walk near people, they walk on the other side of the street. He's not going to be able to push through the crowd. They're going to push him right back out. He has no social standing. His only option is the most awkward thing you can imagine, is as an adult to climb into a tree. Not a really high tree. He's not like so high people don't see him. These are not tall trees. He's hanging right over their heads on a tree. It's the most awkward thing you can possibly imagine because it was his only option. And so Zacchaeus is up in the tree, and everybody, probably sees him there, and they're like, what a joke. What a ridiculous person. And then this continues. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up, and he said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house. Now, this is a little bit weird. You're like, this is presumptuous, Jesus. You can't invite yourself over somebody else's house. That's not how this works. It's like a reverse hospitality situation. I would say if you're looking to make friends in this church, I wouldn't go with this technique. Like if you just go up to somebody, you guys look nice. I'll be at your house 12:30. I'm excited to find out what we're having. It's not a great move. It's not a good look. But there's a reason it had to happen this way, and we'll come back around to that in a minute. It had to happen this way. It's the only way this could have happened. So let's continue. So Zacchaeus, came down at once and welcomed him gladly. So he comes down out of the tree, as awkward as that would have been, while everybody's watching, and he welcomes Jesus, and he receives his invitation to his own house. So then this is what happens next. So all the people saw this and marveled at his love and acceptance. That's not how the story goes, is it? Do you guys who know this story? That's not the verse. It actually reads like this. All the people saw this and they were inspired by his great compassion. That's not quite right either. Actually, this is what really happened. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." They didn't think highly of Zacchaeus now. They thought lowly of Jesus. And this was not the first time. And so this is what we don't get here sometimes, is that this was so incredibly disruptive. Him inviting Zacchaeus to a meal in his house was about as disruptive as you could possibly be to their entire social order. We don't get this because we don't do meals the same way they did, but table fellowship was a big deal in first century. Big deal in first century. And so meals were actually more than meals. They were boundary markers. They were how you determined and showed the world who was your group, who was in and who was not in, who was like a religious or social equal. This was a really, really big deal. So for Jesus to extend this invitation was so disruptive. It flipped everything upside down, and it was absolute disaster as far as they were concerned. So Jesus used meals in a way it was probably the most controversial thing he did in his ministry. Like, I'm not exaggerating. There's a New Testament scholar that says that it's most likely Jesus was killed because of the way he ate. That's how disruptive who he ate with really was to this culture. It's so triggering because people that were nothing like Jesus, people that had no business sitting at the table with Jesus, those people liked Jesus, and Jesus liked them. And that just blew people's minds, right? That's so crazy. And that might be, we're familiar with that. That was not familiar to them. They had no category for it. Luke chapter 7, a few chapters before this, Jesus is explaining his reputation. He's like, I know what you guys say about me. I know what you think about me. I know how you feel. And he said this, Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. It's like, I know you're here because you want to hear what I have to say, but I know behind my back you're like, yeah, he's just a drunk because he hangs out with the wrong crowd. Jesus was aware, and he got this reputation because he hung out with the wrong crowd consistently, inviting the wrong people to meals. Tax collectors were the bottom rung on the social ladder in this community. There's a New Testament scholar, Scott Barchi, and he writes this. This is really important. It would be difficult to overestimate the importance of table fellowship for the cultures of the first century. Mealtimes were far more than occasions for individuals to eat. Being welcomed at a table for the purpose of eating food with another person became a ceremony richly symbolic of friendship, intimacy, and unity. Betrayal or unfaithfulness toward anyone with whom one had shared a table was viewed as unacceptable. On the other hand, and this is really important, when persons were estranged, a meal invitation opened the way to reconciliation. So here we have a clue, right, into how Jesus saw table fellowship. And it was different. He didn't see it as a boundary marker. He saw it as a visual representation of the welcoming heart of God. He saw the meal as grace on display. For him, it wasn't about keeping people out, but inviting people in. So what happens next? And this is really important. Let's keep going. So for Zacchaeus, our bud Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now, like right now in this moment, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount. And this is crazy. And so here's what I want you to do, because what we normally do is at this point we turn to, let's talk about how big of a thing Zacchaeus just did. That's pretty crazy. I can't believe he would do that much. Do we have to do that much? That seems like a lot, that kind of thing. And this is important, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But I don't want to blow past something. This is possibly, look at me. This is really important. I want to get your attention for this. This is the most startling story of change, I think, in recorded history. Like a person in one interaction sacrificed their group, their entire economic success and security, and they risked everything and changed their mind in a way that was just unheard of, unexpected, and completely blew the minds of everybody around. Like, this is shocking change. So what in the world did Jesus do to initiate this kind of change in somebody? And you know what? It's like, well, maybe they had this great, we don't even know if they had the meal, to be honest. This kind of follows right out of the invitation. It's like Jesus invites them to the meal. It says he comes out of the tree, and then he says this. You're like, I don't even know. Maybe the meal didn't even happen, or maybe they did have a meal, but whatever it was, Luke is convinced that the only thing you need to know about what contributed to this degree of change, you've already read. You already have everything you need. The slope that inevitably led to this change was already in place from the invitation. And so let's look at that. Because we want to have this kind of influence. We want to have this kind of influence across the divide. We want to lead people to change. And so what does Jesus show us? How did he break through and unlock influence across the divide? So when Jesus wanted to reach across the divide, he led with love. And now that sounds kind of vague, and we're going to get more specific here. So he led with love. And I mean, led with. He didn't lead with advice. He didn't lead with all the reasons why you're wrong. He didn't lead with, let's open the scriptures and let me show you why stealing from your neighbors is not a cool thing to do. He did not lead with arguments. He did not lead with evidence. He did not lead with all that. He led with a relationship. He led with love. And what did that look like? So we're going to hit 3 things that are going to help us as we try to reach across the divide. So love sees a person, not a problem. Love sees a person, not a problem, not an issue, not a category. What does a problem need? Problems need a solution, right? Problems need to be fixed. Problems need you to bring some evidence, bring some facts. You got to work through a problem, right? But a person has a story. A person's not just a conclusion that they drew. They're this whole web of relationships, experiences, groups that they're a part of, all these things that led to the place where you are, where you might be divided. But they have a whole story. They have a whole thing. And a person needs understanding. A person needs empathy. When other people saw Zacchaeus, they saw a lost cause. When Jesus saw Zacchaeus, he saw a person that God loved, that needed a way home. And he was curious, and he invited him into a relationship. He invited him into a conversation. And guys, you got to understand, influence starts with empathy. It starts with empathy. Stephen Covey wrote this book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Anybody? Some people swear by it. It's a big thing for salespeople and whatnot. But he has this one section, so good. He says that we got to seek to understand before we seek to be understood. If you want to really reach somebody, you got to seek to understand before you seek to be understood. That's how it starts, because it's a person, it's not a problem. Evidence without empathy, guys, evidence without empathy is not persuasive. Evidence without empathy is cold. It feels like an attack. It brings up defenses. It cuts off influence. And if we're honest, if we're going evidence before empathy, we're not even trying to influence. We're trying to win. And that is not the way of Jesus, right? That is not the way of a Jesus follower. We're not trying to win over people. We're trying to influence people. And so we can't start with evidence. We start with empathy. Ask yourself, is being right more important than this person? Because when a view becomes more important than a you, when a view is more important than a you, influence becomes impossible. So love sees a person, not a problem. Secondly, love makes the first move regardless of the cost. Love moves first. If somebody's going to have to take a risk, love says, it's me. I told you before, Zacchaeus didn't offer to invite Jesus over to his house. He really couldn't have. The only way this invitation ever could have happened is from Jesus to Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus would not, it would have been ridiculous for him, from his position in the social order, to approach a religious rabbi and say, hey, do you want to come over to my, it would have been ludicrous. It's impossible. There's no way that ever would have happened. The only way this possibly could have happened is if Jesus made the first move. And it was a risky one. Like, guys, if this hit his Instagram feed, this would have blown up, right? People would have been losing their minds. Oh, Jesus supports theft and government corruption. Jesus, oh my gosh, like people would have freaked out because he associated with the wrong person. And he made a statement about that person and about himself, and it would have been so shocking. But we're not shocked by this, right? We're not shocked when we see Jesus making the first move, because that's what he did for me. Right? That's what he did for you. Jesus always makes the first move. We know him as someone who puts his cards on the table first for us. Paul wrote that it wasn't when we got our junk together and had all the right answers and cleaned up our behavior that's when God loved it. No. It says that Jesus, while we were still sinners, God sent his son. While we were still sinners, while we were moving the other direction, while we were about as far away on the Plinko board as you could possibly be, Jesus comes to us, and he makes a first move, a great risk to himself. Why? Because that's what love does. Love includes before it agrees. And this is where it gets sticky. Love includes before it agrees. Jesus didn't stop by just offering a relationship with him. He offered a way back into the community. He brought him back into the community and said, you have a place in a group, right? And this is so important. You can see it in the text. It flows out of, Zacchaeus makes all these gestures to say, hey, I'm going to win my way back into the community. I'm going to do right by the community. I'm going to make my way back in. And then Jesus proclaims this: today, salvation has come to this house because this man, this would have been as triggering of a statement as they have ever heard. This man, this one that stole from you, the one that was charging you and extorting crazy money from you, the one that made you lose your crops in your field that your family's owned for generations, that guy is a son of Abraham. He's back in the community. He welcomed them back in the group. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost, and inclusion is how we do it. So this would have seemed impossible. There's no way. They could not have conceived of a world in which this man would change. They would not have trusted this. Confusion to skepticism and suspicion to hostility. They were so far in contempt with this guy. There's no way. But Jesus says, hey, it starts here. It starts with inclusion before we agree. I'm going to tell you a story about a very similar thing, but it's more modern, right? So this is a story about a guy named Charlie. Charlie was a part of a group that I think we'd all agree is not going to be our favorite group. These guys were 9/11 truthers. Anybody know what that is? It's a conspiracy theory group that basically are convinced that the 9/11 attack was a government conspiracy. It did not really happen. It was autonomously driven planes or whatever into a building that was programmed to explode. Nobody was actually hurt or killed. It was just to deceive. It's all a conspiracy. And they have all this kind of bogus science that they use. And Charlie had grown up as a kid who never felt like he had a place, never felt like he had a group. He was kind of a contentious guy. And he found, when he found this group and these beliefs, he was really convinced. And then he found that there was this community that's in that group, and they were so supportive. And he went all in, right? He went all in. And Charlie became a leader. He was making the videos on YouTube, the most popular videos. Charlie was the guy making the arguments. He was speaking at the things, the events. He was doing the podcast episodes. He was the guy. He was a leader in the movement of this conspiracy theory. And there was this show. The BBC did this show where they would take conspiracy theory groups that they thought were kind of crazy, and they would bring them on a tour. It's called Conspiracy Theory Road Tour. And they would take the group around and show them scientists and other people to kind of basically debunk their arguments, and whatever they could to try to make an argument and make inroads. And how many people do you think in the history of the show ever changed their mind on Conspiracy Theory Roadshow? How many people? Yeah, most of you saying none. Like That's what you'd expect, because these guys don't change your mind. They really don't, no matter what you say. But the truth is, one guy changed his mind. One did. It was Charlie. Charlie changed his mind. And it was unbelievable. It was so crazy that there was this is a guy that's kind of a journalist who writes books on psychology and different research things. His name is David McCraney, and he wrote a book called How Minds Change, because he was so triggered by what happened here. He was like, something happened to change this guy's mind, and nope, this guy's never should have changed his mind. These people don't change their mind. So what happened? And so he does all this research on how we come to our conclusions and how hard it is and why it's hard to change minds. And he interviews, spends a lot of time with Charlie, and he kind of got down to the one factor that was true of Charlie that wasn't true of anybody else in the room. It was this. Charlie had two social groups. Everybody else just had the truthers. Because these groups are very isolated. Like, you get into this group, everybody else hates you. And so, like, you just kind of, this is your crew. This is all your relationships. This is where you have your love and acceptance and belonging, right? And this is all that. And Charlie had two groups. He was in the truthers, but not long before the roadshow, he had kind of made his way into another group that were into different stuff. And so he had love and acceptance and friendships over there. And so that one factor seemed to be the only thing that made a difference, so that when Charlie sat and listened to the evidence and the arguments, they were actually able to have an impact. Because to change, if change costs you your entire social community, you just can't do it. We literally just can't do it. Dave McCraney says that if without a safety net of belonging, is the phrase he used, without a safety net of belonging, the social risk of change is higher than we're willing to pay. We just can't even hear the argument if it's going to cost us all of our group. And it's kind of like a seesaw. You guys know how seesaws work? If you don't, this is a picture of one, if you remember. You know, they used to have them back when playgrounds were dangerous. We had these cool things. And if you wanted to move the person on this side, what did you do? You put weight on the other side, right? But what if this is gone? What if this is gone? So imagine this. This is kind of like a person whose entire social group, all of their belonging and all of their acceptance is in this group. And if changing their mind costs them that, it's like there's no leverage point. So you can stack all kinds of evidence, even more evidence. You could bring your best evidence. You could stack it for days. And is this person going to be able to move? There's no leverage. There's no leverage. They can't possibly move. But belonging, love, adds this. And now all of a sudden, the evidence can actually bear weight. It's possible to move. The evidence didn't become more convincing. It didn't change. It's just that when love and belonging enter the scene, then all of a sudden, the risk of change goes down, and the ability to change opens up. So, Reece, are you saying that if we show love, that they're inevitably going to change their mind? No. But I promise you, if you don't, they won't. It matters. And Jesus understood this. Jesus understood the critical connection between belonging and our ability to change. And you can see it. The first thing he does, he welcomes Jesus. He welcomes Zacchaeus to the table. You have a seat at my table. And then he says, you're a child of Abraham just like everybody else in this group, because community, belonging is important. So Jesus' ministry model, this was what it was. The mission was to seek and save the lost. The method was to give people a seat at your table before they agree with you. When they're on the outside, when they're in the out group, that's when you want to invite them to your table, because love includes before it agrees. So who's he inviting to your table? All right, like who's coming to mind when you're thinking like, this person, I just can't. I don't understand why they think what they think. I don't understand how they could possibly view it the way they do. It's just, it just drives me crazy. Like, could he be inviting them to your table? Do you just see them as a person and not a problem? Is he asking you to make the first move? And I get it like that. Right now, there's some people in here that are getting so mad because you're like, if you understood what this person did or what they think, it's so crazy. Or if they, like, what happened to me, or if I understood, if I was in your shoes for sure, if I had your story for sure, I would probably be thinking the exact same thing, right? If I had your Plinko board, right, I would come to that conclusion too. But let me ask you this just for a minute to imagine. What would it be like if you actually did this? What would it be like if you led with love? What could the relationship be like on the other side? Jesus brought people together that had no business sharing a table together. And against all odds, he made them a family. He had people in his crew, those disciples. He had guys that were super religious Jews. He had somebody that was a zealot, Simon the Zealot. You know what that means? Is basically that he was willing to go to incredibly violent means to get rid of the Roman oppressors. He was basically a domestic terrorist. And then he invited Matthew, who was a tax collector, who was a Roman sympathizer. And they sat down and had meals together. Can you imagine how awkward dinner would be? But Jesus put these people at the same table because that's the first step. You include. We get on the same page. We have a shared purpose, and then it unites. And he created a family out of people that had no business sitting together. That's what the church should look like when we get this right, guys. My pastor, Andy, says this sometimes, and I just love it. Imagine a world where people skeptical of what we believe are envious of how well we treat each other and amazed at how well we treat them. How compelling would that be? How attractive would a church like that be in our communities? Because when we lead with love, guys, when we lead with love, we make it safe to follow. When we lead with love, we create an environment of belonging that actually gives credibility to our beliefs and evidence. When we lead with love, we create a space where change can actually take place. But mostly, when we lead with love, we follow in the footsteps of our Savior. Would you pray with me? God, thank you that you loved us first, and you loved us deeply, and you fought through our resistance, and you welcomed us into a family that we did not belong in, God, and you welcomed us into a relationship that we did not deserve. And God, I just pray that we would follow you and do that for others. You would help us to open that door, to lead with love across the divide, to have influence, to see change. Ultimately, your Spirit brings about change, but God, we can do everything we can to not fight against it. God, we love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.